It's just going to be a demonstration of how I might get started on the letter form project. So thinking of these letter forms more as shapes versus actual letters, and these compositions communicating your word. So the first thing we're going to do is set up the file. So go to File, it'll be in Illustrator, File, New, and you need two artboards, one for each word. And we're going to make that document 8 inches by 8 inches. So make sure that 8 inches here is selected. And we don't want to bleed. We'll talk about bleeds in another unit. But make sure that's at 0 and then say OK. So that's going to give us our two artboards. So two documents basically that we are going to build our compositions in. Once you've done that, it's time to start thinking about what fonts you might use. What I did down here was I just identified each artboard with the word. So I took my T tool and I single click and I typed bold and I'm going to use the letter B. You might use different letters. It's totally up to you. Some letters might work really well to support bold. Others might not work as well. So I mean, you may choose your initials or maybe a 2-letter word that means something to you. Really, it doesn't matter what letter you choose. And then, I just want to put it in a font that's not so fancy, Arial, and there I go. So I have that as just a reference. Remember that when you do a single click with the T tool and you type, return, it is a scalable object, okay? If you type, use the T tool, click and drag, it becomes a text box. When you scale it down, you're only scaling the text box, not the size of the actual word. So I suggest not using text boxes because you will be very limited on how you can arrange and scale things. The next thing I did, well, I do have sketches here. So inspiration for my sketches, once I start working with these letter forms, it's not really going to look exactly like my sketch, but the sketch just gives me a general idea of what the layout might look like. Because once you start placing your letters in and finding the fonts that you want, it's really going to maybe take on a little bit different form. So what I did was I just found a whole bunch of B's and a whole bunch of S's. To do this, I just took my T tool, single click, and I typed S. Grabbed my move tool to make it bigger, grab a corner and make sure to hold the shift key so you're not distorting it. That's very important. And then I just selected a font that I thought was subtle. So when I think of subtle and bold, subtle is going to be much thinner than bold. So finding a font that's very thin. Maybe I use I know like Gill Sans has a light. So ultralight, light. And then when I want to make a copy of it, this is a trick. If I click on it and drag it, but I hold the Option key, it's going to make a copy. If I hold the Option key and Shift, it's going to keep it in line, in the same line with the other one. So kind of a fun little trick. So that way I can just make a whole bunch of copies of this. I could even take 2 of them and Option, Shift, make more. And then I can just select each S individually, and I can then find a font that I want to use for each one, ultralight. Okay. So then I have a whole bunch of S's, and think of this white or this gray area as a sketchbook. It's kind of like a digital sketchbook. You can put all kinds of stuff. It's huge. You have lots of space to put lots of things, but the actual document, the white areas, is where you'll build your composition. Okay. So looking at some of my sketches and then looking at some of my letter forms, I've kind of chosen some that I'd like to use. So I'm going to start with this one. I'm just going to copy and paste it. And I notice it's called phosphate. I'm going to just start playing around with my composition and looking at the one that I kind of is going to inspire this. I might use that one in the bottom left. And things might change, like I said, as you start playing around. We're only working in black and white. I might tuck this down into the corner like that. The next thing to think about also, one of the exercises was to create outlines. So then you don't lose, well, it just becomes an object versus a font. So now these are just shapes, you know, and I can start playing around with those shapes if I wanted to manipulate them at all. Maybe I want to reflect this. Transform, reflect. And I want to reflect it on a vertical axis. So we've got this one. Maybe I want those two to kind of butt up to each other. Maybe I want to make that smaller. So playing around with arrangement, how they fit. I also think it's a good idea when your letter forms can escape the edges of your picture plane. That creates some really nice visual movement. So leaving the edges of your document, the picture plane. And then from there you can also decide, are you going to add more shapes? So this one right now will have a background. So we'll have to draw the background. And right now I'm just going to keep it white. And I'm going to fill it with white paint. And I'm going to send it to the back so that it's behind. And then later I can change that color. When we start talking about color, we have a background color set. Okay. The next thing I might think about doing is breaking up this space here that I have. Maybe that's a color. Maybe this is a color. And so when I talk about basic shapes, maybe you use other colors that will help break up that space. But for now, we'll just leave them white. You can combine fonts. So maybe let's click on this one. This one is Gill Sans Ultra Bold. So I might take that one out and maybe play around with, copy and paste that, make it bigger. Play around with that a little bit. Object, transform, reflect on a vertical axis. Can play around with that. I really want you to think about these letter forms as shapes and interesting lines versus letters. We should be able to look at these compositions and say, wow, that feels bold. Wow, that communicates that word. Not looking at the compositions and thinking, oh, well, that is the letter B. You know, so think of them as ways to communicate. And I'm going to hold the Shift key, select all three of them, and I'm going to shrink this down a bit so they all fit. So you can see how my idea is slowly evolving a bit. It's not exactly like my sketch, and that's okay. Holding the Shift key. Okay. So just kind of fiddling around with your layouts there. I'm going to move on to the S real quick. I really like this scrolly S. When I think of subtle, I think of thin, like I said. And I'm going to copy it. I'm going to create outlines. So type create outlines. So it's now a drawn object, not a font. So I can no longer edit the font. And these have some really beautiful lines that I would like to fill the composition with. This part of the S is a little thick, so I'd like to maybe just use those other lines as a way to break up that space. Maybe I copy and paste it again and repeat it somewhere. I'm going to reflect this one. You don't have to reflect everything, but it's just a way to use the same shape and make it look a little different. So this one, you know, the image is kind of escaping the picture plane and going on top of the other artboard, which we can also use the clipping mask tool. Remember how we did that with the black square challenge? Later, you know, we can clip it. So select that object and the object we want to clip. Object, clipping mask, make. And there you have two compositions. One feels bold and one feels very subtle. I expect that you obviously play around with the arrangement and the letter forms more than I just did. But just start playing around with where you're going to place all of them. You also have access to this, Pathfinder tool. So if I had, if I wanted to find the differences between two shapes, let's make them both outlines. One of them is white, and the other is black. And you can also think about how you could use these shapes and Pathfinder tools to kind of break things apart, make one letter look like it's inside of the other, much like the Gestalt theory that we talked about. So thinking about interesting shapes, interesting lines, how your eye moves through a composition, and feel free to download your own fonts. I did go online and I downloaded this font, Marshall, and I downloaded this other font called Lovely Home. Feel free to download your own fonts if you find an S that works better with your composition. You can definitely use more than one font per composition. Take a look at the resources that are on Canvas for you, and if you have any questions, please let us know.